alchemy could be defined as the art and science of transformation. And as we know, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's only transforming. So if you want to understand how everything is working and how it's transforming, then understanding the laws and the rules and the processes and archetypes of alchemy become very important. And in fact, they take center stage. There's really three practices inside of the corpus of Hermeticism that are absolutely vital if you consider yourself a Hermeticist, and that's alchemy, and then astrology or astronomy, and then magic or Kabbalah, depending on your persuasion and tradition. Within the context, both of vibrational medicine by Dr. Richard Gerber, that was a fantastic book. He talks about this very same principle, that there's this succession of different planes or dimensions to the human anatomy. And so he refers to this as multidimensional human anatomy. In Kabbalah, we have the very same thing, the very same 4 dimensions. In Kabbalah, you start off with Atzilut, which is the spiritual dimension. And this corresponds to the element of fire, traditionally in the West in the Hermetic text. And then you go down. And once things in the spiritual dimension, this is like our sense of oneness, belonging, the sense of source to creation, et cetera, et cetera. Combination of planets and stars and where they're at and all of these different things, those create myriad different varieties, kind of like programming that we take a look at today. And so the astral is kind of like the short code of the multidimensional body, whereas the causal plane is like the binary, the zeros and the ones of the programming of our reality. Various entities, especially what we call en spirituale, how that has very specific, I can explain it scientifically and draw the parallels from a scientific electromagnetic and electrochemical phenomena perspective, but how all Earth peoples, regardless of where they're at, whether they're Native American, Native Africans, Native Asians, or anywhere in between, like we were talking about before the show, also heavily within the Jinn tradition of Islamic culture, as well as very much so in the Celtic culture with the Fae, you begin to see that there is tremendous reality to that plane, and how a great deal of disease and illnesses and other things like that actually spawn from what most people would refer to as metaphysical or supernatural kind of phenomenon. There are spirits of destruction, that there are spirits of procreation, that there are spirits of many different forms, and even the trees and the every blade of grass, every plant has its own unique spirit, has its own unique intelligence that is at once corporeal by way of the plant, but it's also very incorporeal, and it's also very metaphysical, so to speak, from the Western perspective.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of the Spirit Box. So today we are joined by Alchemist Phoenix Aurelius to talk about his research into Paracelsus and Spagyrics. Now, I really enjoyed this show. There was so much interesting territory to explore, and we really got into it. We got into alchemy and its place in the modern world. We discussed the similarities between the holographic models and hermetic models of reality, and how that plays out in the Cartesian Split, which is really core to the type of work Phoenix Aurelius does. We get into spirit afflictions as a cause of disease and health problems. And we talk about the spiritual impact of living with and in nature, as opposed to living in dominion over nature, which those of you who are long-time listeners to the show know that I think is a really important topic and one that's very close to my heart. But it's all good stuff. And this was an immensely enjoyable show. In the plus section, we get into how gardening and a magical practice eventually lead to kitchen experimentation, be it making vinegars, blending your own oils, or even just making your own chutney, whatever that might be. We talk the practicalities and benefits of fermentation, and we look at it from an alchemical perspective. We also discuss, again, from an alchemical perspective, the disappointing problems with modern beer. So if that sounds like your bag, head on over to the podcast Patreon and sign up. It's, as everybody says, it's the price of a cup of coffee, and you get loads of cool stuff. All right, let's get into it. Phoenix Aurelius. You're very welcome to the Spirit Box. Really nice to have you on the show.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So as the listeners won't know this, but I've already kind of derailed the show by talking for 10 minutes before we even got to started. So we're back in the game. We're focusing now. But I think just to kind of get the show on the road, could you tell people a little bit about kind of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Phoenix Aurelius, and for about the past 17 years, I've been a practical alchemist, and also I would actually call myself a hermeticist, but I focus very heavily, and most of my work is known basically due to the alchemical work that I've been doing and presenting on for many years. And one of the things that I focus on is Paracelsian medicine and Paracelsian theories and cosmology, because he was one of the most important of the alchemists that every modern alchemist draws upon today. And so I've taken all of his theories and all of his writings and translated them from the old German and put them into English as well as possible, and been able to reconstruct so many of the ideas. And then I vet them by using research wellness clients to be able to see which of the ideas maybe belongs in the past or are somewhat superstitious or whatever, and which of the ideas and the tenets are really effective, and what can we lean from and kind of borrow from and incorporate into our modern society today. And in that journey, what I've learned is that alchemy is more or less a perennial philosophy of the way that nature transforms energy from one state to the next. And I've learned to, through a number of different teachers and experiences and other things, just begin to put this into a context where I've weaved it into the fabric of my being. And a big part of my goal is to be able to take alchemy and hermeticism and weave it back into the social fabric by sharing these ideas with others, because they're kind of marginally outliers in the modern world, but I think that they lend a whole lot of credence and necessity to our modern world. You got yourself on
Yeah,
mute there, mate.
I'm back in the game. You touched on something there that I'd like to kind of unpack a bit, and really kind of it's the modern view of alchemy, kind of, and how it sits in kind of the overall kind of like, I guess, metaphysical study areas. I mean, there's a hermetic element which you spoke to already, but how do you see that alchemy fits into the modern world?
Sure. Well, realistically, from my perspective, which is what I'm going to share, alchemy realistically is the cornerstone of all experience and all understanding. Unless you have that as a certain context, you take a look at the world around you and it seems so seemingly separate, it's seemingly distant. Different traditions don't seem to, say traditions like we were talking about before the show, from say the Middle East or the Islamic world, don't necessarily see eye to eye with traditions from a lot of the Western world. But when you begin to understand alchemy, then everything takes it kind of comes together and it begins to make sense. So one of the things that I always like to start off with is that from the most broad kind of objective view, alchemy could be defined as the art and science of transformation. And as we know, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it's only transforming. So if you want to understand how everything is working and how it's transforming, then understanding the laws and the rules and the processes and archetypes of alchemy become very important. And in fact, they take center stage, because that allows somebody to begin consciously seeing, consciously utilizing these very same principles, processes, archetypes, etc., regardless of what they're seeing. And realistically, it becomes a filter of perception so that you can see everything in such a way that you identify the commonality first, and then notice the regional differences or bioregional differences. And that's been something that's absolutely enormous. And just like we can apply, alchemical practice to the laboratory, you can apply it to the mind and to the psyche, of course. You can apply it to the spirit. You can apply it to gardening and agriculture, the way that I've done with alchemiculture. You can apply it to just about absolutely anything that you can think of, because it's a universal and holographic archetypal process. So
It's funny you should mention holographic, because while I was kind of just doing up some notes before the show and reading some of your material and the whole idea of kind of Paracelsus with the man is the microcosm. It really reminded me of kind of David Bohm's model of kind of the theory of implicit order, of wholeness, and the holographic models, and the kind of
Yeah.
what's his name? Is it Michael Talbot wrote a book in the 90s? You remember the holographic universe?
Yeah,
And
yeah, I've got
yeah,
it on the shelf behind me.
yeah. And that's one of the things that really struck me, kind of reading through your work, or listening to you on other shows, was that similar model, but it's ancient,
It is,
and this is a very, very old thing that is established and has been maintained through this tradition.
right?
And that's a fair assessment.
I think that that's an absolutely fair assessment. In fact, sometimes Hermeticism is summed up, very succinctly, and they would say that the Hermetic axiom, is as above, so below.
Mm-hmm.
And realistically, that comes from the Emerald Tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, who tells us that which is above is that which is below, and that
Mm-hmm.
which is below is that which is above for the performance of the miracles of the one thing. If I had to put that in modern day language, what I would essentially say is that in order to create everything in a way that makes sense and returns back into itself, that's completely self-sustaining, creation had to create a relatively simple model so that things on a macrocosmic scale mirror exactly the things that are happening on a microcosmic scale.
Mm.
And obviously in the Western tradition, this comes from Greek thought, and before it Sumerian thought, so
Mm-hmm.
on and so forth. But that is also very much so reflected in the Eastern traditions as well. You get the very same concepts
Mm-hmm.
uh, showing themselves in Hinduism in India, and the very same concepts in Taoism in China, and so on and so forth. And
Mm-hmm.
so you see it just about anywhere that you go, that it's a perennial philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and how does that unpack when you look at your treatments for how you treat people who come to you?
Sure, yeah. So, there's a lot of ways that that actually shows up, but, for instance, one of the main things that I take a look at are the five Paracelsian, what are called entia of disease, as he defined them. And the first one is ens astrale, or cause of disease due to the stars. And it's basically that at the time of your birth, all of the stars and the planets have a very particular position. That becomes kind of like the astral imprint, if you will, of that individual, their own unique kind of thumbprint. And it's, even people who are born the very same day in the same city, depending on where they're at in that city, they could be 5 miles or, several kilometers apart or whatever. You end up seeing that they have differences in the positions of those things in relationship to where they were, even though is, same time, virtually same city, because it's all topocentric. It's topographically variated in terms of what you see when you're looking up at the heavens from that particular topographical location. So, one of those things about the fingerprint is that the planets are always moving, and the planets are more or less moving along the ecliptic. And so there's 13 constellations along the ecliptic, and where the planet lies at a particular, degree inside of one of these constellations, it can create either sympathies or antipathy towards the physical, psychological, and spiritual construction of the individual. And so we can see how things that are happening way out astronomically are having a direct effect on the soul, the spirit, and the body of people here, and creating either, a proclivity for wellness or the lack thereof, depending on those things. So that's kind of the first thing, is like, as above, literally, so below or within. But then, that also goes for the psychological material of an individual, and how that, like, their stresses, their fears, so on and so forth, project through the psyche and have ramifications, therefore, on the body and also on the spirit of their wellness. And so you see this as within, so without, kind of aspect of it too. And so it's kind of, like I said, the cornerstone of everything that I do is being able to take a look very holistically at all of these aspects, and being able to determine what is causing, a Cartesian split in this individual, that's causing, stress, that is giving them a proclivity towards heart disorders or breathing conditions or so on and so forth. Or also, like I said, the positions of the planets or other things. So yeah, it dominates the work that I do.
I didn't realize that like the astrology had such a big part of what you do. But again, listening to some of your shows and reading some of your work, it's massive. It's really key to what you do.
Yeah, in fact, it's like I said, it's one of the major cornerstones. There's really three practices inside of the corpus of Hermeticism that are absolutely vital if you consider yourself a Hermeticist, and that's alchemy, and then astrology or astronomy, and then magic or Kabbalah, depending on your persuasion and tradition. And with all three of those, I'm a very avid practitioner and student,
Right.
lifelong of all of these traditions, and
Hmm.
incorporate all of that into the work that I personally do.
So, in terms of establishing a diagnosis or a method of treatment for an individual, how does that process start?
Well, we have to be somewhat careful so the FDA doesn't come shut me down, because I can't really create diagnosis and I can't treat
Okay.
anybody.
Yeah.
No diagnosing, treating, curing, preventing any disease or illness. But um,
Mhm.
basically, because of the way that the laws are written here in the United States, I just have to be very careful with what I do. And so my
Right.
research projects are really taking a look at the way that things would have been talked about in Paracelsian terms and language.
Mhm.
And then I have freedom to be able to research and explore and find these
Okay.
things. And if people experience good benefit from the work that I do, then that's awesome. That's a great bonus, and it goes into the case studies. But at the present time, they're very, very strict on us about that over here,
Hmm.
and not so much in Europe. Actually, there are tons of radionics practitioners and other people who are
Okay.
able to work with things in both the UK as well as in European Union states. So, with that being said, though, yeah, basically the way that we would take a look at things is that when somebody comes to us, they would tell us, obviously, hey, I'm having these symptoms, I'm sick. And so you write down, you take a look at all of the things that could be going wrong with them in the context of Paracelsianism, which are five causes: the ens astrale, or cause of disease due to the stars; ens naturale, which is cause of disease due to natural factors. This could be the diet that the person is eating. It's also the season of the year. It's also their own constitution, and all of these different types of archetypal things that create imbalances, either of various elements or archetypal qualities, like having too much heat, too much dampness, too much cold, too much wind, things like that. Then there's ens veneni, which is the cause of disease due to toxins and poisons. And then we have ens spirituale, the cause of disease due to spirits or electro chemical phenomena. And then you also have ens dei, which is the cause of disease due to God. And realistically, Paracelsus was very avid and very religious. He called it cause of disease due to God. I, today in my work, being not Christian, I would refer to this as things that transgress the conscience of an individual. So it doesn't matter whether that's your belief system or something that is perennially true. It really depends on your own personal conscience. And if you do something that transgresses that conscience, then that can create, a number of different imbalances in the psyche. And as we know, most of disease is psychosomatic. Even the very best doctors and researchers today in the Western medical paradigm are admitting that most disease has a psychosomatic origin. They just don't know what the connection is or how to scientifically be able to bridge the gaps between all of these various world traditions and what they're seeing in their own practices. So that's the first thing. And that's how we would find out which of those five imbalances are the most imbalanced. And then systematically you go through and you address those things. And as Paracelsus said, and my work with IDF research also seems to vindicate this, is that the most common thing is actually ens astrale. But that doesn't always mean that just because that's out of balance, that that's going to completely address the 100% of the issues, because within the context both of vibrational medicine by Dr. Richard Gerber, that was a fantastic book. He talks about this very same principle, that there's this succession of different planes or dimensions to the human anatomy. And so he refers to this as multidimensional human anatomy. In Kabbalah, we have the very same thing in the very same four dimensions. In Kabbalah, you start off with Atzilut, which is the spiritual dimension. And this corresponds to the element of fire, traditionally in the West in the Hermetic text. And then you go down. And once things in the spiritual dimension, this is like our sense of oneness, belonging, the sense of source to creation, et cetera, et cetera. Then down below that, you have what would be known as Brahya, or the archetypal realm of air. This would be called the causal plane. So this is cause and effect. What is the purpose of this entire life form? What is the purpose of this being's mission, of this being's body, of this being's, so on and so forth. So you're taking a look in the causal plane. Then the next one is going to be Asaya, and this is Yetzira next, which is the archetypal plane of water and the astral plane, and this is where the planets exhibit their influence at the top of the astral plane, but in the lower astral plane, because the planets and the stars are really just archetypal energies that have precipitated from the causal, the combination of planets and stars and where they're at and all of these different things, those create myriad different varieties, kind of like programming that we take a look at today. And so the astral is kind of like the short code of the multidimensional body, whereas the causal plane is like the binary, the zeros and the ones of the programming of our reality. And so in the lower planes of the astral, this is where thoughts and emotions, beliefs, etc., are really heavily dense and present, and where human beings in particular, over all other species on this earth, are able to interact very deeply with the astral in a very conscious way through the conduit of the mind. And then finally, there's the realm of Asaya, which is earth or the physical body. And this is the most dense, but all four of these planes really stack upon one another in a certain regard, but then they're also like, laid over each other, much in the same way as like a hologram is, where you might have multiple different layers, actually one layered over the top of the other, but eventually when you look at it, what it looks like is just a holographic image, a single image that you can take a look at. And that seems to be the Hermetic or Paracelsian viewpoint of how wellness and health and things like that are created. And so being able to find out which of the dimensions a particular imbalance exists in order to be able to address it effectively is a huge part of my work, a huge part of Paracelsianism.
Thank you. That's really interesting. It's so lovely to hear someone speak so eloquently about their research and their profession. It's really enjoyable.
Thank you.
Speaking of that, so you mentioned you've been studying and exploring this area for 17 years. Retrospectively, looking back, what surprised you the most from your journey?
Oh man, that might be one of the more difficult questions I've ever been asked. I think a large part of what's really been surprising is how various entities, especially what we call Inspirituale, how that has very specific, like I can explain it scientifically and draw the parallels from a scientific electromagnetic and electrochemical phenomena perspective, but how all Earth peoples, regardless of where they're at, whether they're Native American, Native Africans, Native Asians, or anywhere in between, like we were talking about before the show, also heavily within the Jinn tradition of Islamic culture, as well as very much so in the Celtic culture with the Fae, you begin to see that there is tremendous reality to that plane, and how a great deal of disease and illnesses and other things like that actually spawn from what most people would refer to as metaphysical or supernatural kind of phenomena. And that to me has been very, very fascinating. And I started learning about obviously fae and fairy folk and things like that at a very young age, like most kids do with fairy tales and so on and so forth. But then continuing my study, especially within the context of modern Druidry and Celtic spirituality, has continually taken me down this road. And, when you talk about the good people and you talk about all of these other really strong phenomena that even modern day individuals who are associated on the land and live rather outside of cities, within a hedge, so to speak, they're able to quantify what these experiences look like. And it's not just some sort of fictional thing to them. So being able to validate that from the perspective of my research and with wellness in particular has been absolutely vast. I think that's one of the biggest things that modern Western, medical approach is completely blind to and not even open to really receiving at this time. So so many people are suffering from these kinds of conditions, though. When you hear about, the host of the fairies, striking you with an arrow, or these fairy pains, and things like that,
Yeah.
there's actual legitimacy to that from my perspective.
Well, that's really interesting, and such a kind of a theme here on this show. So I'd love to talk about that more. And like you said, talk about being struck by fairy arrows, and the idea of like the Angihushi, the fairy wind that touches somebody, then kind of like the associations with epilepsy and strokes and all
Yes.
that type of ailment and condition. And in I guess looking at that and thinking about, well, we're in a relationship with something. We're partially in their territory and they're partially in ours, whatever it is.
Right.
I mean, do you attribute like a mind to the other? Like, is it are we engaging with something that is intelligent in the way that we understand intelligence? I mean, it seems so. I'm you know the thing for me that kind of I struggle with is like everybody else. It's the subject by itself refuses to kind of stay still long enough for us to kind of draw a shape and understand it. Like, and if it does, it's only tricking you. So it's that kind of like self-reflective fractal nature to it. Like, and that's I guess what my question is that like through your experience and kind of I guess treating people or exploring that, people who've been kind of afflicted in this, it like what's is there a rationale that we can comprehend? Are we able to comprehend the rationale of the other?
In my experience, very much so, yes. And we don't always have good modern terminology for these things, but if we reach back into the past and take the terminology that already exists and then put it into a modern context, then we can explain these things almost 100% of the time, if not more. And, like a good thing, you were talking about the wind, like the fairy wind in the Amazon. I stayed in Tarapoto in 2014 and actually taught Spagyria to Corriente Amazonian herbals. They hired me to come down there and to be able to teach this work. And while we were staying at their facility at Yacumaman, there's this hill because they're in the high mountainous jungles, North Amazon basin. And every night, literally every night, the strong wind comes in, and all of the local Indios, all of the Indians that are there, the native people that are there, they will all tell you, you go indoors the second that that wind starts, or preferably be indoors even before it, because you'll be afflicted with all sorts of different types of diseases from the unseen forces of that world. And cosmovision, Amazonian cosmovision is still very much so alive and palpable in those places. They talk about the Fae again, to reach back from my ancestry and to draw some terminology that makes sense to me. They talk about various beings like Chuyachaki and the Yakumaman, which is the great serpent of the waters, and all of these other things that in a way that it is still very real. Even the Christian folk acknowledge that these things are very real and palpable, and they don't go into the depths of the forest without making offerings of mapacho or sacred tobacco. They don't go into places without bringing Palo Santo with them in order to clean off all of the spirits and the entities that might be prevalent in forested places of the Amazon basin and so on and so forth. And you begin to see that things that the West is coming to develop a great interest in, like Shipibo shamanism and so on and so forth, is really just their particular take on things that every Western tradition has already had and incorporated, not just Western tradition, the Eastern traditions as well, that they've already had and incorporated and learned to deal with. And so an interdisciplinary study of these forces leads us to believe that the forces that we're dealing with are the very same. What they would refer to as Chuyachaki, who is this horned being who has hooves, but the body of a man, the skin of a snake, so on and so forth. It sounds so familiar to the Greek concept of Pan, right? The satyr who also has horns in the body of a man, and so on and so forth. And Kernunos in the more Gaulish Celtic society, and so on
Yeah.
and so forth. You begin to see these very same archetypes recapitulated. Even in China, they have Shenong, who taught them about agriculture and how to connect with the land and deities there that were able to bring
Hmm.
a tremendous amount of fertility to the land, and so on and so forth. All of the concepts regionally may be filtered through their own filter of cultural perception,
Hmm.
but the archetype remains exactly the same. And we see this time after time after time. And so it's palpable. And through interdisciplinary study, from a scholastic perspective, you can begin to get a grasp on these things, but then existentially as well, you can really experience these things with just the slightest bit of attunement or the slightest bit of receptivity. When you go out there and you throw out the concept of the modern person seeing things in a very modern way, and you go and feel these things for yourself, you have to say, this is palpable, this is real, I've had an experience. And then that's where the terminology from various cultures and interdisciplinary study really comes in to be able to speak about these things in an intelligent way.
Are you familiar with the Irish philosopher John Moriarty at all?
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah. There's a lovely passage of his, and I can't remember exactly which book it is from. I think it's from one of he did a lot of radio shows back at home with RTE. Um, and he spoke about the idea of dream time in his book, The Dream Time, and saying that the West, we've run out of dreams, where
Yeah.
we've hit a point of we're sterile spiritually, and we need
Yes.
to find and re-engage and kind of spiritually rewild, to use a kind of a modern conservationist term. But he wrote this beautiful passage of seeing the imprint of a bogland hare, where the hare had slept, and he lay down in it and he put his head in the imprint of where the hare had been, and he asked the hare to take all the Western nonsense and modernity out of his head and just leave him in a pure wild state. And I remember listening to that 20 years ago and kind of thinking it sounded beautiful, but not really understanding it. And I think 20 years later, I understand it a lot more in terms of what he's talking about, and that state of rewilding, of connecting with nature in its rawest form, and seeing the true breadth of it. I feel a lot of that when you talk about the Amazon world, because the interesting thing about Ireland, I mean, I'm Irish. I always think Ireland's interesting, right? You
What
know,
isn't
yeah,
interesting about Ireland?
is that whole thing of like our structure of reality has really always been mythos. It's
Yes.
not been logos. We've always been mythos, and that's how the perception of reality really was up to a long time. And I guess it was like up to the point of like, the first TV stations really crushed that, whereas the Industrial Revolution did that a lot, kind of 150 years earlier in the rest of Western Europe. And that kind of belief that actually, no, the fairies are out there and they can be dangerous. You need to be aware of that. I think it's quite was quite prevalent. I remember being a kid and having that being told to me. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
you know.
Well, and anywhere in Western Ireland, I mean,
Yeah.
so connected into the concept of the She and the fairy folk
Oh
that
yeah. Yeah.
it's a interwoven into
Mm,
daily life,
mm,
just the way that you live, especially in the West. I mean, there
yeah.
are other places, of
Yeah.
course, that
Yeah.
it's still much so alive and
Mm,
palpable, but just for instance, the Gaeltacht communities mostly still survive in the
yeah.
west of Ireland more than many other places. Otherwise, that or they're like new offshoots, new starts of younger people who are interested in it.
No, you're absolutely right. That's 100% accurate. Like, I grew up in the Gaeltacht, and like that's absolutely correct.
Yeah,
That is, and it's an intrinsic part of the area.
yeah.
But it was something that you'd said previously. I heard you say this. I've been binging on your podcasts in preparation for the show, and it was that idea of kind of like in cultures that are closer to nature, that have not been through modernity, that closeness to nature and to the environment means the exposure to entities is far more tangible, and it has far more tangible, I guess, implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think you were talking about the Amazon and just saying kind of how that the veil is thinner, and that strikes me that the west of Ireland is similar. Not as much now, but it was
Yes.
thinner. And Eddie Lenihan, the Irish storyteller, has a thing that he talks about, kind of like seeing lights in the boglands, and that they used to be really prevalent. But kind of during the Irish War of Independence, when you had kind of the flying columns, the IRA man who used to kind of hide basically out in the bog and come in and do guerrilla attacks and all that kind of stuff. Between that happening and then the advocate of motorized cars going around the area with electric lights was the language that was used. Yes. That meant the kind of then the fading away of the bogland lights,
yes,
fairy lights.
Absolutely. Yeah, sadly enough, I mean, that happens. The more domestication. So I'm actually reading this book right now. I think it's been out for maybe a number of years, but I'm reading a book right now called Witchcraft Medicine. It's written by 3 Germanic authors that are absolutely fantastic, very scholarly. The whole thing is researched exceptionally well from a scholarly position, but also from a practical position of having practiced various modalities of witchcraft, or growing up in regional traditions, in the Germanic tradition especially, where Frauholle and all of these other Germanic entities are a really big thing in their culture as well. Much the same, like when you get up into more distant places from bigger cities, you get out of Berlin, you get out of Bonn, you get out of all these places, you begin to see more farmlands, especially towards Austria and Prussia and into Switzerland and so on and so forth. They still have these very strong cultural identities of what they do and how they utilize magic and plants as magical entities to be able to ward off evil entities and evil spirits and so on and so forth. And it's a really fascinating book. But they were talking about this the first few chapters really elucidate and bring up in such beautiful imagery how people from Neolithic ages onward have constantly been in touch with various entities that they give names to and mythology to, and understand in a way that is very archetypal. Even though they can't always see them, they can sense them, they can perceive them. And how, as of the start of modernity, and especially, even since the Inquisition in particular, because, even with Christianity, all of the regional gods and entities really just became recapitulated under the name of a saint. So that instead of seeing, Cernunnos, or the horned one, coming through the fields and offering fertility, now you're seeing one of the saints doing the same thing. And, the associated clergy members aren't so uptight about that. But starting as of the Inquisition, especially when we talk about Francis Bacon's work, which I'm torn about because I have many of Francis Bacon's written works here as an alchemist, but you begin to see this very clear, decisive split, whereas nature was something that was, so to speak, the kind of like the maiden that belonged to God, where God brought, the seed of things and seeded this land, but it was the feminine aspect of the earth that really brought all of these things into life and into birth, and that the unseen forces of this world were really just messengers or angels or carriers of those forces of life and of destruction. Whereas at the time of the Inquisition, you start to see that nature actually becomes something that needs to be completely brought under the slavery, and that's actually the term, brought under the captivity or the slavery used by Francis Bacon, of mankind, and it needs to be dominated and controlled and enslaved. And that we're still in that mindset, post-Inquisition mindset, where nature is something that is to be subsumed or consumed and brought under the control of the logical Western archetypal and now scientific mind. And it just needs to be exploited as much as possible because it's just resources, and you use it for your physical well-being or financial well-being or whatever. That viewpoint is such a stark contrast to anything that has happened before the Inquisition that, if people really just open themselves mildly to the concept that there are these forces, that there are things that maybe they can't explain with their logical mind, and they get out into the wild places, they're going to feel them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are some things that are completely undeniable, such as David Pleiades' missing 411 cases, especially here in the United States with Yosemite National Park and other parks like this. You get out into these wild areas that the natives have always said, don't go there. Like, there are these spirits that you don't deal with. And then people go there, with the Western mindset of like, oh, it's just nature, and, disappeared.
Yeah.
Nothing shows up but their entrails and so on and so forth. And you see that there are spirits of destruction, that there are spirits of procreation, that there are spirits of many different forms. And even the trees and every blade of grass, every plant has its own unique spirit, has its own unique intelligence that is at once corporeal by way of the plant, but it's also very incorporeal, and it's also very metaphysical, so to speak, from the Western perspective, in that there are these plant spirits that aid the fertility of that plant itself. So you can harvest the plant, but the plant spirit remains behind unless you summon it and bring it with you. And you see a lot of this actually too with the jinn. I see a lot of, in Indonesia in particular, songs or spellcraft that gets associated with harvesting various plants or making various concoctions, especially balur silat is this type of oil that's used in the Pencak Silat tradition that is able to draw down wounds and things like that. And not only do
Right.
you need magnetic sand inside of it, but you also need to be able to recite the incantations properly in order for the jinn, the spirits of those plants, to be able to be infused inside of that particular concoction that you make. So, we see this all over the place, all over the world. I think it's really important that we start paying attention to these things a little bit more and incorporating them as modern
Mm.
individuals.
I couldn't agree more. I absolutely couldn't agree more. And you you see a river with personhood. You one would hope you would be less inclined to abuse it, to pollute it.
Yes.
And I find it interesting enough. The idea of kind of decolonizing society and kind of decolonizing one's mind. I mean, for me, the first stop with that is the approach to nature.
Yes.
Like an understanding that it's not dominance, that we are part of it. And I think we just it's something that we have to achieve, or we're in pretty dire
Yeah.
straits, really.
Yes. Well, and a lot of things, just really fast while I have this thought. One of the things that most people are completely ignorant to are the spirits that are present in any creation, whether nature is creating it or whether man has created it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you best believe that by building, square houses out of, highly synthesized materials and so on and so forth, there are spirits that are attached to that as well. It's not dead, it's not inert. And
Mm-hmm.
these types of spirits are largely destructive based spirits. And so we see people in highly crowded cities in these large high rises and flats and so on and so forth, where they begin experiencing a sense of depression or states of mania,
Mm.
schizophrenia, and all these other things. And modern, Western medicine just wants to throw psychiatric medications at them, where that usually only exacerbates the issue or makes the individual numb enough that
Mm.
those things are still there, but they don't care quite as much, or so on and so forth. Whereas when you actually begin to listen to what those spirits have to say and why they exist there and how they breed and how they live in these places of what we would refer to as natural sterility. There's no more nature there. It's just
Mm.
humanistic construction. I think the spirits are equally as present there. It's just that people have, the more that a present is spirit or a spirit is present, the more people tend to shut it out entirely and just not even notice it, not even be aware of it. And the more that it happens, the more that they push back with their sense of ignorance
Mm.
or lack of wanting to know. So, I think that all of that is really, really critically important, that people
Mm.
begin thinking about the types of negative spiritual entities and forces that exist inside of the city experience,
Mm.
and that we haven't ever escaped this spiritual phenomena. We've only tried to numb ourselves to it
Mm.
through the medications and through the worldview that make us believe that it's not there and that it's not real. But we're still equally as impacted by it.
That's a really interesting thought. I think if you if you pull that thread, you look at then kind of the extreme behavior that we don't acknowledge as extreme behavior.
Exactly.
Like that kind of like excessive consumption, like of anything.
Yes.
Like it's a weird thing. That constant need for the new. Like and that's again, it's some sort of disassociation as well.
Well, I mean, if you take a look at it too, if nature spirits allow for natural fertility and bring things not only into being, but
Mm,
out of being so that they can come back into being in a different way, much like the concept of the elder tree or even also the alder tree
mm,
does in traditional Druidic lore and so on and so forth, we begin to see that those same forces are screaming out, but they have become perverted by the delineations of humanistic behavior in the modern realm. And so the spirits inside of houses tend to create perversions of sexuality.
mm,
And if you take a look at the entire history of pornography, for instance, and you take a look at it from a scholastic perspective today, there are so many different perversions of pornography that it's no longer just an act of copulation.
mm,
There's all sorts of abuse that goes along with it and so on and so forth. These people are inventing this within the context. They're not out in nature creating natural beds anymore from
mm,
the herbs and the leaves and so on and so forth and copulating this way, which was a very strong tradition the entire world over. But now they're secluding their sexuality, creating their sexual life forces of creation, and it's becoming this massive perversion of abuse and degradation
mm,
and raunch and so on and so forth, that it can't really even be used anymore for a sense of procreation or
mm,
bringing life and creation to the forefront. And so people are just as impacted by these things now as they ever have been. The only difference is that they've created a container that doesn't allow for the natural expressions to happen and has created very unnatural expressions to thrive.
mm. Hey, that's it's really interesting, and like again, if I mean, I would extend that to kind of like closeness to seeing like how life happens, how life plays out in the wild as well. Like the kind of the seasonality with animals on in how they behave, breeding and whatnot. I mean, I think that exposure to seeing those patterns of behaviors, it grounds you. You kind of what's going to happen in springtime. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Yes.
Uh, um, it's hard to say, but I do think that there is this there is the movement of like you got cottage core and kind of people kind of moving back to kind of slow food
Yeah.
and all that kind of stuff, but it's still it's still embryonic,
Yes.
and ultimately you're up against the might of Amazon. The most powerful entities in the world are tech giants, and they steer a lot of our behavior. Um, we're getting the same kind of emotional, or even kind of not even emotional, way beneath that, the kind of the chemical responses to who likes something,
Yes.
that we've tweeted and what have you. Um, so I think that overall, that connection to nature in whatever way people can achieve it is hugely important. And again, when we were chatting before the show, I mean, I think one of the main takeaways that people are going to have is like, what happened in that 10 minutes that they keep they keep referring to
Exactly.
before the show. It's like I've been listening for the guts of an hour, and they still keep talking about this first 10 minutes.
Exactly.
It was good stuff, guys. Sorry.
Yeah.
um, but we were talking about kind of the alchemical relationship with the plant kingdom, and I was talking from a very simplistic sense, which is kind of how I am, in terms of engaging with my own garden, and kind of how it's hugely important to me, and the just the practice of being in the garden, tending to my plants, harvesting them, taking the seeds. One of my favorite things to do is to send people seeds, just to go like, just to go out. This gives me so much joy. I hope it gives you so much joy too, But what it does to me, and this is the really interesting thing, and I find that, and it's interesting you're talking about the idea of being in the kind of the artificial constructs of our kind of modern life. So I spend my life essentially either in my garden or basically immersed in technology, and I know the different head state. I have a very, very different emotional response. I almost have one that's constant noise and another one with no noise. Well, there's nothing. There's wonderfully nothing yammering on in my head, and that state comes from the garden, and but it's the thing where like I don't really have to do that much with some of it. Tomatoes just grow in my garden now. Like I've gone past the stage where I'll actually try and sow loads of stuff, and some 50% of it mightn't work, but I'll still get a crop of about 50 kilos of tomatoes because they just grow now,
Exactly.
And that for me is that reciprocal thing where it's like to me, it's like how I think about it, how I feel about it is that, well, they know this is their home too as well. So they just come, and they know I look after them. And again, I know that's a pretty kind of naive way for the Western mind to perceive that, but I kind of, it resonates with me. And it's, when I look at kind of animistic thinking, I kind of see that too, the way people kind of engage with plants that way. It's like, well, why did you do that? Because the plant told me.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting that Westerners are starting to get that back, and there's less of a kind of a cultural kind of like, or the sledgehammer of modernity and empirical science just kind of crushing these concepts. Anyway, I was going to ask you a question, and I got about a 5-minute waffle about me talking about my garden. So
I'm glad that you did, though.
Oh, thank you. You're very generous. But I kind of wanted to talk about, well, how does the plant kingdom fit into what you do, and how you engage with plants around their specific components and elements and substances?
Yeah, so plants are an incredibly important concept to what is traditionally referred to as the genius loci in Latin. The genius loci being the intelligence of a particular location. It's made up of the minerals and the microbes and the vegetative life and so on and so forth. And then, because everything is kind of fractal, the genius loci of the plants themselves would be known as the viridis geni, or the intelligence of the green beings. And realistically, the way that the plants fit into all of this is that they have their own characteristics, their own spirit, their own volition. Like, why is one plant used for one particular thing and not used for another? From the scientific perspective, we can say, oh, well, that's because of its chemical constituency, and we can try and explain it all away. But realistically, the plant itself has a different volition than one of the other plants in its neighboring vicinity. And they don't all do the same thing. So they can be growing in the same environment, but they're not all used for the same thing, which throws parts of the aspects of the doctrine of signatures out the window, whereas at least in terms of the region where it's found, but it also shows you that each plant with its own particular signature, the way that you see it, does it have thorns on it? Is it a soft leaf? Is it a hard leaf? Is it very foliage-like? Or are the flowers the parts that we use, or the roots the part that we use, and so on and so forth? They express themselves in a language that is just beyond human language, actually. It's so palpable because it's just like data. Okay, so in the technology based experience, we would take, say, like a flash drive or a thumb drive or something like this, and we put it inside of the computer, and then that computer can be able to process the data. Well, nature is data in the exact same way for the biological computer known as the human organism. And so we take that plant and we put, metaphorically, that plant is like a thumb drive, and we put that inside of our mouth or inside of our body, and then you begin to extract the data from that plant or from that material, and you begin to notice that there's a great deal of information there that is able to inform, quite literally, the way that your physiology works or behaves. It alters, it adds like a new program, or sometimes it boosts the program, or changes the entire operating system depending on what plant you're putting in your system. So all of these things are really, really critical from a spiritual perspective, to be able to see what is the spirit of this plant, what is the soul of this plant, and what's the body of this plant. That's really why alchemy reached out so deeply to me from a very early age. I was 17 when I started practicing, like 16, 17 when I started practicing this work, noticing that each one of those components can be isolated through various extraction processes. Like, for instance, whereas modern chemistry would say, oh, the terpenes of the plant are largely the essential oils, in alchemy, we would say that a certain way of approaching the essential oils needs to be extracted through these archetypal processes of, say, steam distillation or hydrodistillation. And what that yields, in our terminology, is the volatile soul of the plant. So it's all of the inherent talents, all of the inherent interests, and kind of like the scope of why that being came into existence in the first place. Like, what is its overall purpose? That's its volatile soul. And then you have the fixed soul of the plant, which can come out, commonly, because cannabis is such a common thing and so many people are extracting cannabis worldwide these days. I would say that the equivalent of what Rick Simpson oil is, or what they called Phoenix tears initially, that concentrates all of the fixed sulfur of the plant. It's like a plant extract that has all of the color of the plant. It has all of the tannins. It has all of the chemical constituents, whether those are, cannabinoids or terpenoids or so on and so forth. All of those aspects are part of the plant that are tied up in its personality, but largely its physical based personality, which is to say, like, if I were to talk about our fixed sulfur as a human being, that'd be the color of the skin, the color of the hair, the clothes that you wear, the color of your eyes, the sound of your voice, all of those things that lend to your persona and your psychological perception of yourself, and help the inherent soul, the volatile soul, come through in a way that kind of makes sense and fits the persona. But they're not entirely physical traits per se. Like, we could change the clothes of an individual, we can change the color of the eyes of an individual, especially with contacts and so on and so forth. We can change, so many of the aspects around us by adding things to the experience. But still, the way that the soul comes across is going to, the higher soul, the talents or the interests, is still going to be more or less the same. So here we are as humans, dyeing our hair and shaving off body hair, and doing all these things that inherently change the way that the natural medicine comes across. But plants don't do that. They exist fully in their natural state, and they allow those defining characteristics to be a huge part of their healing identity. And together, the volatile sulfur, or any of the volatile oils and essential oils, as well as all of the terpenoids or alkaloids and so on and so forth, tannins, cruder chemical constituents, all of those are the medicinal identity of the plant. And the spirit of the plant is what happens when you ferment a plant and then distill the spirit out of it. So we've all drunk spirits before, like wishkaba, right? We've all had plenty of moments of saying slancha to each other, or prost, whatever. And these
Indeed.
Yeah, this is where we're getting the spirit of the plant, and actually we're imbuing the spirit as human beings with that intention. So slancha, health, pros is like, cheers kind of thing. Even saying cheers in English is, that very same concept of being able to say, may the spirit make you happy, may it not be a depressive experience for you, and so on and so forth. And so the spirit is highly impressionable, and you're constantly trying to interject yourself into that experience anytime we take that ferment or those distilled spirits on. And then finally, the body of the plant is all of the undead mineral corpus. And in fact, as alchemists, we're trained very much so. A huge part of our work actually is taking the corpus of the plant, those minerals that even fire cannot burn away, and being able to crystallize them into crystals so that you get a revivification, a rebirth of the body. And then we'll take all three of these things, the spirit, the body, and the soul, and put them together and recapitulate them in a new way in our pharmacopoeia that leaves all of the dross behind, and more or less magnifies the potency and the purity the essence of that particular plant spirit, that plant being. And yeah, so for me, the plants are equally as alive, and trees just as much so, perhaps actually even more so, because they exude this enormous, sphere of vital life force energy of qi, and they kind of intermediate between the terrestrial realms and the celestial realms, constantly drawing out energy from celestial realms, like from the sun, using photosynthesis, but then simultaneously growing beneath the ground just as they grow above the ground. They become kind of like a cosmic antennae, really, that adds so much to the experience of what we experience as the Viridis Geni in any particular genius loci. So it's yeah, for me, plants are the things that I'm absolutely the most passionate about, because they are so easy to be able to put into our bodies, whether we're using the spagyric process or not. And even using them in the witchcraft tradition or in various magical traditions across the world, plants have this huge role, even in incense, right? You make the right incense out of certain aromatic herbs, and you light it, and it alters your consciousness. It fills the room with an otherwise not present energy or spirit. And so being able to utilize that and call upon that, and work with these entities in a very conscious way, I think has enriched my life in ways that are so numerous. I can't even really count them all anymore.
So we're getting close to the hour and a half, and I'd like to ask kind of what's next for you, and where's the right place for people to find you if they want to find out more about your work.
Sure. So yeah, the next things for me. Wow. Um, I just continue doing research all the time, and then bringing my research through podcasts like this, and through my written works and so on and so forth, to the public, to be able to share from my lens to their mind what I have been able to see, so that hopefully it opens up our minds and opens up our ability to think about health and medicine and the relations that we have with nature, and begin to see all of that in a more holistic perspective that ties multiple different different studies kind of together, and you begin to see it as one, just like we were talking about, at some point gardening and kitchen work become the same thing, and then that extends into the laboratory too, because you grow heaps of oregano one year, it's like, well, I've got more dried oregano than I know what to do with, and then you begin to infuse some in olive oil, or you begin to infuse it into other things. The second that you do that, you're actually stepping into the laboratory, because at some point you'll end up using that oregano oil and that you made, not just in your salads and in cooked dishes, but you'll end up putting it on your skin at some point, and it got rid of toenail fungus. Oh wow, look at that, that's crazy, maybe that's really good for this. And that experience keeps us evolving, and so being able to show my lens of that, I think, is probably the most important part of my work, and what continues to drive me, so that we have things to draw upon. I was born into a very inert culture that didn't have a lot of that. It was all Western pharmaceuticals. And so what a big part of what drives me is to be able to preserve these traditions of working with the natural world, not only for my daughter's generation, but for many generations to come, in such a way that people can look back and say, you know what, the culture was mostly dead, but there were people out there who were doing these things, and hopefully that inspires them. So yeah, I think that's what's next for me, and it's virtually the same that it has been for these nigh 20 years. But the way that people can get in touch with me and learn more about my work is just to visit my website, which is phoenixaurelius.org, and that's PHOENIXAURELIUS, Aurelius, like Marcus Aurelius.org. And yeah, I offer, not only do I have an entire apothecary that funds the research largely that I do, where people from all over the world, well, except for European Union, unfortunately, they don't want any American supplements of any sort, and so they end up not making it through more often than not. Yeah, Ireland actually tends to be very not strict about that, but if I tried to send these to Germany or Switzerland or Italy, they get returned about 9 times out of 10. And even the countries that do get it, because I have students in Sweden and Ireland quite a great deal, they oftentimes have to pay a hellacious tax on those things. So
Right.
unfortunately, if you're in other places like that, it's at your own risk. But North America, South America, most of Asia, almost all of the islands, we ship to almost all of those countries, with the exception of very few. But then I also do intrinsic data field research and work on people remotely doing research wellness programs, so that we can find out which of the 5 entia might be affecting somebody or causing
Hmm.
a particular condition. And it's just people largely who are supporting my work and supporting my research, who allow this type of work to really be perpetuated in the United
Hmm.
States, because unlike European Union areas and the UK, we're not allowed to use intrinsic data field technology here in the United States for any sort of wellness related purpose whatsoever.
Hmm.
The FDA is very strict about that. So
Right.
I have to do everything I do as research. And so it comes largely from people who are very, very interested in
Hmm.
this work, promoting the research and talking about it to other friends and so on and so forth. And we have huge successes in the
Hmm.
research and the case studies that we've been able to gather, and we're just looking to get more and more and more of those,
Right.
so that we can hopefully down the line create some peer-reviewed studies and even medical double blinds. But it all starts with showing these case studies, and then being able to eliminate whatever factors could have otherwise been
Mm.
causing improvements or whatever. So slow work, but really important. And
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, we want to run 100% off of it's publicly funded. So if people like our work and are funding the research that we do, then we're able to continue doing what we're doing. And once public research stops, then we're not able to, or once public support stops, and we're not able to continue and
Hmm.
keep sharing. So we've been very fortunate that the more people we expose this work to, and the more perspective that I offer from what I learn and take away from this work, the more support we get. And it's been absolutely amazing, because it takes us into being able to do many more things that otherwise are way outside of the budget of anybody except for large corporations. And
Right.
we're
Right.
we're so pleased and really humbled by the fact that enough people support us that we're able to get many of the pieces of equipment that are
Hmm.
necessary, and perform a lot of things that otherwise we'd be very restricted to by funding. And we don't do this for a profit. Everything is all public response and public funding. And so
Hmm.
it's and because I talk so much about spirits and work outside of the main botanical sciences, we're not very eligible for most grants, or
I feel yeah. I feel yeah that one.
yeah.
It's yeah. It's I had the same trouble with editors, with photographic magazines.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm like, what do you mean you don't want a story about gin and left hand pat rituals? Everybody's interested in this stuff.
Yeah, and they're like, yeah, well, how's it gonna sell? Where's the money on the back end?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Uh, but Phoenix, it's been absolutely lovely chatting to you, and I do hope I can tempt you back onto the spirit box again at some stage in the future. But it's been
Oh, without a doubt, this has been absolutely wonderful.
fantastic. But thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it, and let's catch up soon.
Excellent. Likewise, brother. Thank you.
There you have it. That was glorious. I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did, and be sure to check out Phoenix's links in the show notes. And hopefully we can get him back soon on the show. Okay, we'll wrap it up there. As always, thank you for listening, and talk soon.